Hi, I am Gwen Macchione. Today we'll be discussing Ecuador and the question of carbon markets. I'd like to thank our faculty advisor, Professor Jossam, as well as the rest of my team, Karen, Jessica, Russ, Ariella, Caitlin, Griffin, Sophie, and Liz. Now for today, we'll start with a brief introduction of who our client is before we move on to Ecuador and how they are mitigating deforestation. And then we'll talk about nature-based solutions, some carbon pricing mechanisms, and our pathways forward. Now, with Conservation International, oh, there you go. We're looking at ways to use carbon to fund conservation efforts in Ecuador. And Conservation International is a nonprofit environmental organization that's working towards empowering societies to responsibly and sustainably care for nature, our global biodiversity, and the well-being of humanity. Now, Ecuador is actually the first country to give rights to nature when they rewrote the Constitution in 2008. Now, this is very forward-looking, but does present unique problems for implementing nature-based solutions. They've also ratified the Paris Agreement and have set nationally determined contributions to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. Ecuador does have a very long history of environmental protection. They've been working with WWF to protect the Galapagos Islands for over 50 years now. They have a population of 17 million. 6.8 of these identify themselves as indigenous, though major indigenous right nonprofits identify as a higher number, up to 30% of the population. Now, this is all within an area slightly smaller than Nevada, which is covered 40% by forests, and this 40% forest is 2% of the entire Amazon basin, which is the largest carbon-based largest land-based carbon sink in the world. Now, there's a problem with deforestation there. Prior to 2008, Ecuador actually had the highest rate of deforestation in South America. Much of this began with its oil boom in the 1970s, as the oil was underground and the forest was on top of it, unfortunately. However, more recently, it's been fueled by agricultural expansion. Now, these drivers are both closely linked to Ecuador's economy, which is largely based on the export of oil and agricultural products. But having ratified the Paris Agreement in 2017 and updating its nationally determined contributions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in 2019, Ecuador has ambitions to decarbonize its power sector and to protect more of its Amazonian forests. As one of the planet's most effective carbon sinks, the protection and reforestation of the Amazon has the potential to not only help Ecuador meet its own nationally determined contribution, but to mitigate the impacts of climate change globally. And we could really leverage a powerful nature-based solution here. So what actually is a nature-based solution? So I'll get this right. There you go. Now, CI states that a nature-based solution is any action that conserves, restores, or improves the use or management of these ecosystems while, and this is very important, increasing the carbon storage and/or avoiding greenhouse gas emissions. And Ecuador currently uses the Sociobusca Program, which was initiated by Conservation International in 2008. This raises funds to pay landowners to protect the forest, with the goal of conserving natural forests and other native ecosystems to protect the ecological, economic, cultural, and spiritual values, significantly reduce deforestation and associated greenhouse gas emissions, and to improve the well-being of farmers, indigenous communities, and other groups living in the country's rural areas. While progress on deforestation has been made in Sociobusca's implementation in 2008, the Ministry of the Environment has suffered budget cuts over the last couple of years, which does make it very difficult to continue funding conservation efforts. So we've been tasked by our client, Conservation International, to weigh the gains and losses of a number of potential carbon pricing options that could help increase funding for the Sociobusca program. Great. Now, carbon pricing refers to a number of ways of attaching a price to emissions. In theory, if the cost of emissions is high enough, polluters will choose to reduce emissions to avoid those costs. There are lots of mechanisms to try to achieve this. These include carbon taxes, where polluters pay a tax on the amount of carbon they emit, cap and trade. Regulators set a maximum number of emission allowances, and polluters can buy and sell extra allowances between them, a bit like the stock market. And then carbon offsets, where organizations can pay projects that abate carbon emissions and claim the reductions against their own emissions, so offsetting the greenhouse gas emissions. All these methods have pros and cons, and how effective they are depends on the specific design as well as the situation they are applied to. If successful, they will achieve some reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, as well as generating some revenue either for the government or emissions reduction projects. Now here we have three scenarios. the Colombia system, which is actually a liquid fuel carbon tax and forest offsets, the California system, which is a cap and trade ETS international market system, and Emergent, which is a nonprofit doing voluntary offset, setting up a voluntary offset market. All right, now this is our research methodology thus far. We initially developed a project control plan, started a literature review, which was divided into stakeholders and case studies, and then from there further divided into available carbon pricing mechanisms and gains and losses of those carbon pricing mechanisms for Ecuador. We've also been conducting interviews of subject matter experts, such as academics, nonprofit members, and Ecuadorian government officials. So what comes next for our team? Now that we have decided on 3 pathways to focus on, we need to complete our analysis. This will include some financial analysis to estimate the revenue that each of these mechanisms might produce. We also need to complete some political analysis to determine what the effects of each mechanism might be. And for this, we will be considering the pros and cons of each policy, such as gains and losses of Ecuador not entering the carbon market, and also its impacts on various stakeholder groups, as well as how politically feasible it is. Because of giving rights to nature in the Constitution, Ecuador doesn't allow people to appropriate natural services, so not all potential carbon markets are equally constitutional there. Lastly, we will explore whether there are likely any unintended consequences of each of these mechanisms. Once we've completed our analysis, we will have to decide what the key points and issues that we should communicate to Conservation International are through our deliverables. This will involve figuring out what the key messages are that Conservation International want to then communicate on to the Minister of the Environment. It is our hope that this work will play a role in convincing the government of Ecuador to resolve the constitutional issues around carbon pricing and pursue policy that benefits Ecuador's forests, people, and their climate. It's not letting me move on. Thank you. Any questions?
Okay, thank you. Okay. Jenny, it looks like you're up first up with questions.
Great job, Gwen. Really well done presentation and very interesting topic. I wanted to know, or I wanted to ask if you could elaborate more on, I guess, the specific stakeholder category of indigenous communities and Ecuador and the impact that carbon pricing would have on indigenous communities, and especially in the context of land rights, and I guess how you're looking into that through the social impact assessment you're doing.
Right now, we're mostly looking at that through interactions with nonprofits and officials. But yeah, there is a big issue because sometimes with some carbon offset programs, the government will basically buy and take ownership of the land that was formerly held in indigenous control. And these groups are reluctant to sell to outside groups, understandably. So right now it's an issue of, protecting the land without seizing it from people who have lived there for thousands of years.
All right, Colleen.
Hey, Gwen, thank you so much for that presentation. Let me get a little bit closer to my computer. Someone told me the audio is bad, so hopefully you can hear me okay. So I was curious. Okay, great. I was curious to know, is Ecuador, are they partnering with any international organizations, or are they receiving funding from any international organizations to help them with conservation efforts?
Yeah, right now they're receiving money from the UN's Green Climate Fund, and this is being used to help fund the Sociobusca Program.
Thanks, Gwen.
Oh, Jenny, you can ask another question.
Thank you. I had a follow-up question. Are you looking at, or maybe if you shared, can you elaborate more on alternatives to carbon pricing, or like, I guess a hybrid where there's like indigenous ownership and stewardship of land management? I think that there are cases of that in other countries.
Well, I'm sure they are. We haven't dug too deeply into that because our issue is mostly the Ecuadorian Constitution, where most of the climate solutions we looked at are actually unconstitutional there because they're considered to be appropriating natural services. So you can put money towards conservation in Ecuador, but you're not allowed to basically get something back for it.